Did you know that Christopher Lee never actually said the famous line, "I am Dracula," in the way most people remember? In fact, he barely spoke at all in the entire movie. This elegant vampire moved through shadows and silence, terrifying audiences without needing many words. Horror of Dracula shocked the world in 1958. It brought blood to the screen in bright red color for the very first time. Hammer Films took an old monster and made him dangerous again. Christopher Lee became the vampire that haunted dreams. Peter Cushing became the hero we all wanted to save us. Together, they created something that still makes us check our windows at night. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about Horror of Dracula. Number 20. The blood that changed everything before Horror of Dracula, movie blood looked like chocolate syrup. It was dark, thick, and totally fake. Audiences knew it wasn't real. But Hammer Films wanted something different. They wanted blood that made you gasp. They wanted blood that looked wet and fresh and terrifying. So the studio made a bold choice. They would film in color, not black and white. And they would use bright red blood that shocked the eye. The art department mixed their own special recipe. They blended different paints and dyes until they found the perfect shade. It had to look real under hot studio lights. It had to photograph just right on film. The team tested dozens of formulas before they got it perfect. When actors first saw the blood on set, some of them felt genuinely uncomfortable. It looked too real. That was exactly the point. During filming, Christopher Lee would be covered in this red mixture. It stained his costumes. It stained his skin. Makeup artists spent hours cleaning him between takes. The bright blood splashing across the screen made audiences jump in their seats. Critics complained that it was too graphic, too violent, too much. But that controversy made the movie famous. People lined up around the block to see what everyone was talking about. They wanted to see the blood that newspapers called shocking. Horror of Dracula earned more money than anyone expected. Other studios noticed. Soon, everyone started using color blood in their horror films. One small decision in a makeup room changed monster movies forever. What looked simple on screen took months to create. Number 19. Christopher Lee's silent terror. Christopher Lee spoke fewer than 20 lines in the entire film. Count them yourself if you watch closely. The script gave him almost no dialogue. Most actors would panic at this limitation. How do you create a memorable villain without words? But Lee saw it differently. He understood something powerful. Silence can be more frightening than screaming. A look can tell more than a speech. Lee studied animals before filming began. He watched how predators moved. He observed snakes, wolves, and hunting cats. They never announced themselves. They simply appeared, smooth and deadly. Lee brought that quality to Dracula. He practiced moving without sound. He learned to glide across the floor instead of walking. His footsteps became whispers. His gestures became threats. On set, Lee barely blinked. He trained himself to stare without moving his eyes. Other actors found it deeply unsettling. Peter Cushing later said that looking into Lee's eyes during scenes genuinely frightened him, even though they were friends. The camera loved Lee's face. His height made him tower over everyone else. At 6 feet 5 inches, he seemed impossibly tall in 1958 when most men were much shorter. The camera looked up at him, making him appear even more powerful. Director Terence Fisher realized early that Lee didn't need dialogue. His presence said everything. Fisher cut even more lines from the script. He let Lee's eyes, his movements, his silence do the acting. When Dracula finally did speak, audiences leaned forward. Those few words carried enormous weight because they were so rare. Lee created a vampire that felt ancient and intelligent. This wasn't a mindless monster. This was a predator who had survived centuries by being smarter than humans. All of that came through without speaking. Less became so much more. Number 18. Peter Cushing's personal tragedy. Peter Cushing brought real sadness to his role as Van Helsing, and the reason breaks your heart. Just before filming began, Cushing's wife, Helen, fell seriously ill. She had been his partner for years, his closest friend, his whole world. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. She grew weaker every day. Cushing wanted to cancel everything and stay by her side, but Helen insisted he take the role. She knew how important it was for his career. She told him to go make the movie. She would wait for him. So Cushing went to the studio every morning carrying a weight no one could see. He performed his scenes with energy and focus. Then he rushed home every evening to sit beside Helen's bed. The exhaustion showed in his face, but it made his performance even better. Van Helsing looked like a man fighting against death itself. That wasn't just acting. That was Cushing's real battle. Between takes, crew members would find him sitting alone, very quiet, lost in thought. They didn't know what to say. Christopher Lee knew. The two actors had become close friends. Lee would sit with Cushing in silence, just being present. Sometimes that's all anyone can do. Helen did recover. Thankfully, the illness passed. But those weeks of fear stayed with Cushing. You can see it in his eyes during the film. When Van Helsing fights to save Lucy, when he races against time to destroy the vampire, Cushing brought real desperation to those moments. He knew what it felt like to fight death and feel helpless. He knew the terror of possibly losing someone you love. Director Terence Fisher never knew the full story during filming. Cushing was too professional to let his personal life stop production. But years later, Fisher watched the film again and recognized the pain in Cushing's performance. He called it the most honest acting he'd ever directed. Real life bled into the movie. The performance was brilliant because it was true. Number 17. The castle that wasn't a castle, Dracula's castle, looks massive on screen. It has high towers, long corridors, stone staircases, and dusty libraries. It feels like you could get lost in there for days. But here's the secret. Almost none of it was real. Hammer Films didn't have much money. They couldn't afford to rent an actual castle. They couldn't build huge sets. So they got creative with tiny spaces and clever tricks. The entire castle was built inside one small studio in Berkshire, England. The main hall, where Dracula greets Jonathan Harker, was barely bigger than a living room. The staircase that looks so grand was only 8 steps tall. The camera just never showed the top. The library where Harker discovers Dracula's true nature was a corner with some shelves. The bedroom where the vampire women appear was redressed and reused for multiple rooms. They changed the curtains, moved furniture around, and shot from different angles. Suddenly, one room became 5 different spaces. The cinematographer, James Bernard, worked magic with lighting. He used shadows to hide where the sets ended. Dark corners concealed the edges. Candles created depth that wasn't really there. The audience's imagination filled in the rest. Outside shots of the castle were actually a painted backdrop. Artists created a detailed painting of towers and walls. They photographed it at an angle to make it look three-dimensional. Then they added a real door in front of the painting. Actors would walk through that door, and it looked like they were entering a massive fortress. The crew nicknamed their tiny studio the Closet of Horror. They joked that Dracula's castle was smaller than Dracula's bathroom would actually be. But audiences believed every stone. The illusion was perfect. Even today, people are surprised to learn how small the sets were. Sometimes the best magic happens in the smallest spaces. A little creativity made a closet feel like a kingdom. Number 16. The fangs that kept breaking. Christopher Lee's vampire fangs caused constant problems. They weren't the comfortable plastic fangs actors use today. 1950s dental technology was primitive. The fangs were made from hard acrylic that had to be fitted over Lee's real teeth. They clicked into place, but they didn't stay put. Lee had to talk with them in. He had to move his mouth without dislodging them. Every expression risked popping a fang loose. During his first scene, Lee opened his mouth wide to frighten Harker. One fang shot out like a tiny rocket. It flew across the set and hit a camera. The crew burst out laughing. Lee was mortified. They tried stronger adhesive. Lee applied the glue himself before each scene, but the glue tasted horrible and made his gums burn. Sometimes his mouth would water, breaking the seal. A fang would slip sideways, making Lee look less like a vampire and more like he had a dental emergency. The crew kept a jar of spare fangs on set because they broke so often. The acrylic was brittle. If Lee bit down wrong, a fang would crack. If he bumped it with his tongue, it might snap. Makeup artists were constantly fitting new ones. Lee learned to act around the fangs. He adjusted his speech, talking through closed teeth. He timed his mouth movements carefully. When Dracula needed to look threatening, Lee would part his lips just enough to show the fangs, then close his mouth before they fell out. The technique worked brilliantly on film. Dracula's quick glimpses of teeth became more menacing than a full snarl. Lee figured out how to hiss and growl without moving his jaw much. He used his throat and breath to create sounds. The limitations forced him to be creative. In the final battle scene, Lee had to fall and fight while keeping the fangs in place. He clenched his teeth so hard his jaw ached for days afterward. But not once do you see a fang fall out on screen. Every take where that happened got cut from the film. Lee's professionalism saved the illusion. What looked effortless took painful concentration. Number 15. The censors who tried to stop everything British censors hated Horror of Dracula before it was even finished. The script alone gave them nightmares. They sent Hammer Films a list of things that absolutely could not appear on screen. No blood on necks, no visible bite marks, no women appearing seductive, no religious symbols used as weapons, no violence against women, no staking scenes. The list went on and on. If the filmmakers followed every rule, they'd have no movie left. Director Terence Fisher read the censors' letter and made a decision. He would film the movie he wanted to make. Then he'd deal with the censors later. The studio worried, but Fisher was confident. He knew that once the film was complete, cutting it would be harder. He shot every scene he'd planned. Blood sprayed, stakes pierced hearts. Women beckoned in flowing nightgowns. Crucifixes burned vampire flesh. Fisher delivered the rough cut to the censors. They were horrified. They demanded massive changes. Fisher negotiated scene by scene. He made some small cuts but refused to destroy key moments. The arguments went back and forth for weeks. Finally, the censors gave the film an X rating. In Britain, that meant no one under 16 could watch it. Hammer Films pretended to be upset, but secretly they celebrated. The X rating made the film seem dangerous and adult. It became free advertising. When Horror of Dracula opened in London, the X certificate was featured prominently on posters. People were curious. What was so shocking that children couldn't see it? Theaters sold out. Lines wrapped around buildings. The censors' attempt to limit the film actually made it more popular. Similar battles happened in America. Some cities banned the film completely. That just made people in other cities more eager to see it. Religious groups protested. Newspapers wrote scandalized articles. All the controversy created enormous publicity. Hammer Films didn't spend much on advertising. They didn't have to. The censors did the marketing for them. What was meant to stop the movie made it unstoppable. Every obstacle became an opportunity. Number 14. The color red that almost wasn't. Hammer Films almost made Horror of Dracula in black and white. The decision to use color came dangerously late in production. Here's what happened. Color film was expensive in 1958. It required special cameras, special lights, and special processing. Black and white was cheaper and easier. All the classic horror movies had been filmed in black and white. Frankenstein, The Wolfman, the original Dracula with Bela Lugosi. They were scary without color. Why spend extra money? The studio executives felt confident. They planned a black and white film. Sets were designed for shadows and contrast. Costumes were chosen in shades of gray. Then someone showed producer Anthony Hines a color test. They had filmed a short scene just to see how it might look. The test showed a vampire biting a victim with bright red blood on pale white skin. Hines watched it and felt his stomach turn. It looked shocking. It looked real. It looked completely different from anything he'd seen before. He called an emergency meeting. Hines argued that color would make their vampire film stand out. Every other horror movie looked the same. This would look new. The studio executives worried about the budget. Color would cost significantly more money. Could they afford it? Would audiences even care? Hines promised the investment would pay off. He believed color was the future of horror. After heated debate, the executives agreed. But production had already started. Sets were already built. Some scenes were already filmed in black and white. Everything had to be reconsidered. The art director had to repaint sets. Colors that looked good in black and white looked wrong in color. Costumes had to be changed. Some fabrics that seemed elegant in gray looked cheap in color. The cinematographer had to redesign every light setup. Color film required 3 times more light than black and white. They brought in bigger lamps. The set became unbearably hot. Actors sweated through their makeup. Filming slowed down. The budget climbed higher. Studio executives panicked. They demanded daily reports. Hines stood firm. He believed in the vision. When they finally saw the finished film, everyone understood. The color didn't just add beauty. It added horror. The red blood, the pale skin, the deep shadows, the rich costumes. Everything felt more intense, more real, more disturbing. One decision made almost too late defined the entire film. Risk created reward. Number 13. Christopher Lee's hatred of the role. Here's something strange. Christopher Lee became famous as Dracula, but he deeply resented the role. He never wanted to play vampires. Lee was a serious actor. He'd studied Shakespeare. He'd performed in classical theater. He wanted to play complex characters with rich dialogue. Then Hammer Films offered him Dracula. Lee almost said no. The script had barely any lines. The character seemed one-dimensional. But Lee needed money. Acting work was scarce. He took the job thinking it would be one small film that nobody would remember. Horror of Dracula became a massive hit. Suddenly, everyone wanted Lee to play vampires. Hammer Films begged him to make sequels. Other studios offered similar roles. Lee felt trapped. He agreed to a few sequels, always hoping each would be the last. But each film made money, so producers demanded more. Over the next 15 years, Lee played Dracula 9 times. He grew to hate it. The role overshadowed everything else he did. Interviewers only wanted to talk about fangs and coffins. Serious directors stopped considering him for other parts. They saw him as just a horror actor. Lee would give interviews complaining about the vampire films. He called some of them rubbish. He said the scripts were terrible. He begged writers to give Dracula better dialogue. Nothing changed. The films kept coming. What made it worse was that Lee's performance was genuinely brilliant. He brought elegance and menace to a role that could have been silly. Critics praised his work even when they hated the movies. But that brilliance trapped him. No one else could play Dracula as well. Audiences demanded Lee. Only in his later years did Lee make peace with the vampire. He realized that Horror of Dracula had given him a kind of immortality. New generations discovered the film and fell in love with his performance. Young actors told him how much he'd inspired them. Lee finally accepted that being Dracula wasn't a curse. It was a strange kind of gift. But for decades, he carried resentment. The role that made him famous felt like a prison. Success came with chains. Number 12. The director who saw Dracula as tragic Terence Fisher directed Horror of Dracula with an unusual vision. Most directors saw vampires as pure evil. But Fisher saw Dracula as tragic and lonely. This wasn't a monster who enjoyed killing. This was a creature cursed to exist forever in darkness. Fisher told Christopher Lee to play Dracula with sadness underneath the menace. Look at the scene where Dracula stands alone in his castle. There's a moment where Lee's expression shifts. For just a second, the vampire looks tired. Eternally, impossibly tired. That was Fisher's direction. He wanted audiences to feel a tiny bit sorry for Dracula, even while fearing him. Fisher believed the best villains think they're right. Dracula wasn't evil in his own mind. He was simply doing what his nature demanded. A lion kills to eat. A vampire drinks blood to survive. Where's the morality in that? This perspective made the film more complex than typical monster movies. Van Helsing becomes not just a hero, but someone performing a mercy killing. He's ending Dracula's curse, setting him free from endless night. Fisher filmed the final death scene with this in mind. As Dracula crumbles to dust, there's almost a sense of relief. The monster's face relaxes. The struggle ends. Fisher wanted that moment to feel like release, not just victory. Some actors didn't understand Fisher's vision. They played their parts as straightforward good versus evil. But Lee understood completely. He found the loneliness in Dracula. Watch his eyes when he looks at Lucy. There's hunger, yes, but there's also longing for connection. Dracula wants to create companions because he's been alone for centuries. Fisher rarely explained his deeper intentions in interviews. He let the film speak for itself. But cast and crew recognized his unusual approach. He directed a horror film with empathy. He asked audiences to fear the vampire while understanding him. That balance made Horror of Dracula more than just scary. It made it haunting. The film stayed with viewers long after the credits rolled. They couldn't quite forget that lonely figure in the castle. Evil became complicated. Monsters became real. Number 11. The Actress Who Fainted for Real. Valerie Gaunt played the vampire woman who attacks Jonathan Harker early in the film. Her performance looks terrifying and desperate. There's a reason for that. Gaunt was genuinely unwell during filming. She had caught a severe flu, but didn't tell anyone. In 1958, actors feared being replaced if they showed weakness. Missing even one day of filming could cost you the job, so Gaunt showed up to set with a high fever. She felt dizzy and weak. The makeup chair made everything worse. The hot lights made her sweat. The heavy costume made her overheat. But she smiled and said she was fine. Her big scene required her to run down a corridor, throw herself at the actor playing Harker, and beg him desperately for help. Then Dracula appears, and she has to scream in terror. It's a physically demanding sequence. Gaunt rehearsed the movements, feeling like she might collapse. When cameras rolled, she used every bit of strength she had. She ran down the corridor. She grabbed the actor. She delivered her lines. Then she screamed. And then she actually fainted. Her eyes rolled back, and she dropped. The crew thought it was brilliant acting. Someone yelled, "Cut." Perfect. Then they realized Gaunt wasn't moving. She'd actually lost consciousness. The set erupted in panic. Someone brought water. The studio nurse rushed over. Gaunt came to after a few seconds, confused and embarrassed. She tried to stand up and do another take. The director made her sit down. Only then did she admit she'd been sick. They sent her home immediately. But here's the interesting part. They used the take where she fainted. It's in the final film. That moment where she collapses looks so real because it was real. Her genuine distress made the scene more powerful. When audiences watch that scene, they're seeing an actor literally fall unconscious. Gaunt recovered and returned to finish her remaining scenes. She was more careful after that, but she remained proud of her performance. The role became one of her most famous. Years later, horror fans would approach her at conventions. They'd tell her how much that scene frightened them. She'd smile and tell them the secret. Sometimes the best performances come from the worst circumstances. Real weakness created powerful cinema. Number 10. The music no one was supposed to hear. James Bernard composed one of the most famous horror scores in film history for Horror of Dracula. Those thundering drums and shrieking violins became iconic. But Bernard almost lost the job before he started. Here's what happened. Hammer Films hired Bernard based on his previous work. They trusted him, but they didn't give him much time. Bernard had only 3 weeks to compose and record the entire score. That's an incredibly tight deadline. Most film scores take months. Bernard worked day and night. He composed music that was bold and loud and aggressive. Previous horror films had quiet, creepy music. Bernard wanted the opposite. He wanted music that grabbed you by the throat. He used huge crashing chords. He made violins scream. He added thundering percussion. The music felt violent. When Bernard presented his score to the studio executives, they hated it. They said it was too much, too loud, too aggressive. Audiences would be overwhelmed. One executive called it a bloody racket. They wanted Bernard to compose something more traditional, gentle, and spooky. Bernard refused. He believed his score matched the film's intensity. A polite little melody wouldn't work with bright red blood and brutal violence. The music had to hit as hard as the images. The argument escalated. The executives threatened to use a different composer. Bernard said they'd have to fire him because he wouldn't change his vision. Director Terence Fisher stepped in. He'd heard Bernard's score and loved it. Fisher argued that the bold music made the film more exciting. It didn't just accompany the action, it amplified everything. The executives reluctantly agreed to test the music. They showed Horror of Dracula to a preview audience with Bernard's score. Then they showed it to another audience with temporary quiet music. The difference was stunning. The film with Bernard's aggressive score got much stronger reactions. People jumped in their seats, they gasped, they grabbed each other. The film with quiet music felt flat by comparison. The executives had to admit they were wrong. Bernard's score stayed in the film. When Horror of Dracula opened, critics immediately noticed the music. Some loved it. Some found it overpowering. But everyone remembered it. Bernard's work became as famous as the film itself. Other composers started imitating his style. Horror movie music got louder and bolder. Bernard had changed the entire genre. The score that almost got rejected became the standard. Confidence defeated doubt. Number 9. Peter Cushing's perfect preparation. Peter Cushing prepared for his role as Van Helsing like he was studying for final exams. Cushing was famous among actors for his intense research. He never just showed up and read lines. He wanted to understand every detail of his character's life. For Van Helsing, Cushing went deep. He read Bram Stoker's original Dracula novel 3 times, taking notes. He researched 19th century medicine and science. He learned about Victorian attitudes toward death and religion. He visited museums to see medical instruments from the period. He wanted to know exactly what tools a vampire hunter would use and how they worked. Cushing created a complete backstory for Van Helsing that never appears in the film. He decided when Van Helsing was born, where he studied, how he first encountered vampires, why he dedicated his life to fighting them. Cushing wrote pages of biography. He knew what Van Helsing ate for breakfast. He knew Van Helsing's fears and hopes and regrets. None of this was in the script. But it informed every choice Cushing made. Watch how Van Helsing moves through scenes. He's confident but cautious. He touches religious objects with reverence. He speaks with authority earned through experience. All of that came from Cushing's preparation. On set, Cushing would sometimes pause before a scene and close his eyes. Other actors thought he was meditating. He was actually stepping into Van Helsing's mind, seeing the world through his character's eyes. Cushing brought props from home to make his character feel real. He wore a watch that belonged to his grandfather. He carried a small Bible in his pocket, even though the camera never showed it. These details helped Cushing believe he was Van Helsing. Director Terence Fisher rarely had to give Cushing direction. Cushing arrived knowing exactly what his character would do in every situation. Sometimes Cushing would suggest changes to scenes based on his research. Fisher trusted him completely. If Cushing said Van Helsing wouldn't do something, they'd find another approach. Other actors were amazed by Cushing's dedication. Christopher Lee later said, working with Cushing taught him the importance of preparation. You can't fake depth, you have to build it. Cushing's performance feels real because he made Van Helsing real in his own mind first. The work no one saw made the work everyone saw unforgettable. Number 8. The staking scene that shocked the world. The scene where Van Helsing stakes the vampire woman shocked audiences in 1958 more than anything else in the film. People had never seen anything like it. Previous vampire films implied staking happened off-screen. You'd see the hero raise a stake, then cut away. When you cut back, the vampire would be dust. Horror of Dracula showed everything. Van Helsing lifts the stake. He drives it down. Blood spurts up. The vampire woman screams and writhes. Her face contorts in agony. The violence is explicit and brutal. Terence Fisher designed the scene to be shocking on purpose. He was tired of polite horror. He wanted audiences to feel the brutality of vampire hunting. This wasn't a clean, easy job. This was violent and terrible, even when necessary. The special effects team built a fake body for the staking. They created a torso with a bladder of fake blood inside. When the actor playing Van Helsing brought down the stake, it punctured the bladder. Blood sprayed up realistically. They had to reset the mechanism for every take. It took hours to prepare. The actress playing the vampire woman was filmed separately, reacting in agony. Her performance was so convincing that some crew members felt uncomfortable watching. She didn't just look scared, she looked like she was dying in horrible pain. In editing, Fisher cut between the stake going in and the woman's face. Back and forth. Stake, face, blood, scream. The editing made it feel even more violent. When censors saw the scene, they demanded it be cut entirely. Fisher refused. He argued that the scene was essential. It showed the cost of fighting evil. Heroism wasn't pretty. The censors backed down, but insisted the film receive an X rating. When audiences first saw the staking scene in theaters, people screamed. Some covered their eyes. A few walked out. But most stayed, gripping their armrests. The scene lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt much longer. Time stretched under the intensity. Newspapers published scandalized articles. Church groups organized protests. All the controversy made people more curious to see the film. The staking scene became the most talked about moment in horror cinema. It set a new standard. After Horror of Dracula, vampire films couldn't go back to gentle implications. The violence was out in the open. Fisher had opened a door that couldn't be closed. One scene changed the rules forever. Number 7. Christopher Lee's incredible height problem. Christopher Lee stood 6 feet 5 inches tall. In 1958, that was extraordinarily unusual. Most men were 5 feet 8 or 9. Lee towered over everyone. This created constant problems during filming. Doorways were too short. Lee had to duck through every entrance. The crew started calling him the Ducker. Ceilings were too low. Wide shots showed Lee's head nearly touching the top of the frame. It made the sets look small and cheap. The production designer had to rebuild door frames taller. They raised some ceilings. But they couldn't change everything without blowing the budget. The cinematographer found creative solutions. He would film Lee from low angles when they wanted him to look powerful and threatening. But when Lee stood next to other actors, the height difference created composition problems. Everything looked unbalanced. In scenes with women, the difference was even more dramatic. Lee would be speaking to the top of an actress's head. It looked awkward. The crew built small platforms for shorter actors to stand on. This brought them closer to Lee's eye level. But the platforms created new problems. Actors had to step carefully so they wouldn't fall off. In wide shots, you could sometimes see the platform edges. Editors had to crop the frame to hide them. Lee learned to adjust his posture. He would slouch slightly or spread his legs wider to lower himself. But this made him look less elegant. Dracula needed to seem graceful and aristocratic. Slouching didn't work. The most challenging scenes were the fight sequences. Peter Cushing was only 5 feet 11, several inches shorter than Lee. When they faced off, Cushing looked small. Fisher wanted them to seem like equals, not a giant fighting a regular person. The solution was clever camera work. In close-ups, they filmed Cushing from low angles and Lee from higher angles. This evened out their apparent heights. In the final fight, Lee and Cushing spent hours on the ground, wrestling and struggling. This eliminated the height problem entirely. When both men are horizontal, size matters less. Lee's height did create one perfect moment. In the final scene, when Dracula is caught in sunlight, Lee's tall body creates a longer, more dramatic shadow. As he crumbles to dust, his great height makes the fall seem more tragic. What was usually a problem became a powerful image. Sometimes limitations force solutions that end up being better than the original plan. Number 6. The sunlight death that nearly failed. The film's climax shows Dracula dying in sunlight, crumbling to dust in seconds. It's one of the most famous death scenes in horror cinema. But it almost didn't work. The effect was incredibly difficult to achieve. The crew had no computer graphics. Everything had to be done with practical effects and camera tricks. They tried multiple approaches. First, they attempted to film Christopher Lee while technicians pulled him backward with wires, hoping he'd disappear behind a cloud of dust. It looked ridiculous. Lee just seemed to be falling backwards while someone threw dirt at him. Next, they tried filming dust and superimposing it over Lee's image. The dust looked fake and floaty. It didn't seem connected to Lee's body at all. The crew was running out of time and ideas. Terence Fisher called a meeting with the special effects team. They needed something simple that would actually work. The solution came from combining multiple techniques. They would film Lee reacting to sunlight. They'd film a dummy decomposing. They'd film dust and ashes. Then they'd edit all the pieces together very quickly. The human brain would fill in the gaps. For Lee's part, the makeup team created progressive stages of decay. First, Lee with normal makeup. Then Lee with sunken, darkened skin. Then Lee with age lines and shadows. Lee would hold poses while makeup artists worked on his face between shots. Each stage took 40 minutes to prepare. Lee stood under hot lights for hours, barely moving. The dummy was created from plaster and cloth. It was shaped like Lee's body in Dracula's costume. Special effects filled it with dust and ash. When they collapsed the dummy with wires, the dust poured out realistically. They filmed this at high speed, so when played back at normal speed, the collapse looked fast and violent. The editing was crucial. Fisher cut between Lee's face, the dummy collapsing, dust swirling, and close-ups of bones and ash. Each shot lasted only a fraction of a second. Your eye couldn't process the individual images. You just saw Dracula dying. The first test screening revealed a problem. The sequence was too fast. Audiences didn't understand what happened. Fisher added a few frames to each shot, slowing the death just slightly. Now it was clear, but still shocking. The final version lasts about 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, you see Lee's face age and decay, his body collapse, and dust scatter. It's seamless. For decades, audiences wondered how they did it. Some thought it must be trick photography. Some guessed it was animation. No one suspected it was just very fast editing of simple elements. The effect that almost failed became iconic. Clever solutions saved the day. Number 5. The bite marks that required surgery. Creating realistic bite marks on actors' necks was harder than anyone expected. Makeup artists tested dozens of techniques. They tried painting marks, too flat and fake. They tried applying wax and cutting into it. It looked lumpy and weird. They needed something that would look like real puncture wounds with real depth. The solution was disturbing. Makeup artists used small surgical tools to create tiny actual wounds on actors' necks. Not deep cuts, but shallow piercings that would heal quickly. Actors had to consent to this. Some refused. They didn't want anyone cutting their skin, even superficially. But a few brave actors agreed. The makeup team would sterilize the skin and the tools. Then they'd make 2 small, precise marks. The wounds would bleed a little bit, which was perfect. They'd enhance the blood with makeup blood. The result looked shockingly real. You could see depth and texture. The marks photographed beautifully on film. Between takes, medics would treat the wounds to prevent infection. After filming, the tiny marks would scab over and heal within days. But this technique couldn't be used repeatedly. An actor could only have their neck cut a few times before scarring became a risk. So makeup artists saved the surgical method for close-up shots. For wider shots, they went back to wax and paint. The camera was far enough away that the fake marks looked acceptable. Actress Melissa Stribling, who played Mina, allowed the surgical technique for her crucial neck-biting scene. The close-up of Dracula's bite on her throat shows real indentations in her skin. It makes viewers deeply uncomfortable because their instincts tell them something is wrong. The marks look too real. Modern audiences sometimes don't believe those are practical effects. They assume it must be digital enhancement. But in 1958, there were no digital tools. Just brave actors and dedicated makeup artists willing to try extreme techniques. The pursuit of realism had real costs. Small scars on actors' bodies testified to their commitment. What you see on screen sometimes required actual blood. Cinema's illusions can be surprisingly real. Number 4. Peter Cushing's dangerous stunt. The final fight between Van Helsing and Dracula required Peter Cushing to perform a dangerous stunt that could have killed him. The scene shows Van Helsing running and leaping onto a long dining table. He slides down the table's length, grabs the curtains, and tears them down. Sunlight floods the room, destroying Dracula. It's a thrilling moment. But it was incredibly risky. The table was about 15 feet long and narrow. Cushing had to sprint, jump, land on the table, and maintain balance while sliding at speed. One mistake and he'd crash to the floor. The studio wanted to use a stunt double. Cushing refused. He insisted on doing it himself. He argued that audiences would notice if someone else performed the stunt. The camera would have to cut away from his face, breaking the tension. If Cushing did it, Fisher could film it in one continuous shot. That would be more exciting. Cushing practiced the move dozens of times. He'd run across the set, judge the distance, and leap onto the table. The first 20 attempts failed. Cushing would land wrong and slip off. Or he'd land right, but couldn't slide smoothly. The table's surface needed to be slick enough for sliding, but not so slick that Cushing couldn't control his movement. The crew applied furniture polish. Too slippery. Cushing shot right off the end. They tried a light oil. Better, but still unpredictable. Finally, they found the right combination of wax and polish. Cushing could slide, but maintain some control. The next challenge was grabbing the curtains. Cushing had to slide down the table at speed, reach up at exactly the right moment, grab heavy fabric, and pull with enough force to tear the curtains from the rod. All while maintaining his balance. If he grabbed too early, he'd miss. Too late, and he'd slide past. If he pulled too hard, he might yank himself off the table, not hard enough, and the curtains wouldn't fall. The curtain rod was rigged to break away, but Cushing still needed to pull hard. On the day of filming, Cushing took a deep breath. Cameras rolled. He sprinted across the set. He leaped. He landed perfectly. He slid down the table. His hand shot up. He grabbed the curtains. He pulled. The rod broke away. Curtains fell. Sunlight poured in. Cushing didn't smile or celebrate. He simply stood up and asked, "Was that good?" Fisher yelled, "Perfect! We got it!" The crew applauded. Cushing had done in one take what seemed almost impossible. The stunt looks effortless on screen. It took days of practice and genuine danger. Cushing's dedication created one of the film's most memorable moments. Sometimes actors risk everything for a few seconds of film. Number 3. The blood-drinking scene that was cut. Terence Fisher filmed a scene that was too disturbing to include in the final movie. It's never been shown publicly. The scene depicted Dracula drinking blood from a victim in explicit detail. Not a quick bite and cut away. A long, horrible feeding. Christopher Lee bent over an actress's throat. The camera showed his mouth on her skin. Makeup effects made it look like he was actually drinking. The actress writhed and weakened. Lee's face was smeared with blood. The scene lasted nearly 2 minutes. It was intensely graphic and sexual. Fisher wanted to push boundaries. He thought audiences could handle it. When the studio executives saw the footage, they were horrified. This wasn't horror. This was obscene. They felt it crossed a line from frightening to exploitative. The actress looked like she was being assaulted. Lee looked like a predator, not a supernatural monster. The scene made vampirism too real, too violent, too uncomfortable. Fisher argued the scene showed the true horror of what vampires do. It stripped away the romance and fantasy. This was the reality of the monster. But the executives refused. They said the scene would get the film banned entirely. No rating board would approve it. Censors would demand cuts that would destroy the whole movie. The scene had to go. Fisher reluctantly agreed. They removed the entire sequence. It was never included in any version of the film. The footage supposedly still exists in Hammer Films' archives, but it's never been released. Only a few people have seen it. Those who have refused to describe it in detail. They just say it was deeply unsettling. Removing the scene actually helped the film. The movie suggests horror rather than showing everything. Audiences' imaginations filled in the gaps, often creating something more disturbing than what could be shown. Less became more. But Fisher always regretted cutting the scene. In later interviews, he said it was his most powerful work in the entire film. He believed future generations would have appreciated it. He wanted horror to be honest about its darkness. The scene that was too much became a legend. Sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones we never see. Number 2. Christopher Lee's accidentally brilliant moment. The most iconic shot in Horror of Dracula happened by accident. It's the moment when Dracula's eyes turn bloodshot with fury. Blood vessels burst red across the white of Lee's eyes. It's terrifying and unforgettable. That effect wasn't planned. Here's the real story. The scene required Lee to lunge at the camera in rage. He was supposed to run forward, snarling and threatening. Simple enough. But Lee wanted the moment to feel explosive. He decided to give everything to the lunge. He would sprint forward as hard as possible and stop just inches from the camera. Fisher called action. Lee exploded forward with shocking speed and violence. He ran full force. At the last second, he stopped himself. The physical strain was enormous. Lee's face flushed red with effort. Blood pressure spiked. Tiny blood vessels in his eyes burst from the exertion. His eyes instantly looked bloodshot and wild. Fisher yelled cut and rushed over, worried Lee had hurt himself. Lee blinked, confused. He said he felt fine. Someone brought a mirror. Lee looked at his eyes and was startled. They were streaked with red, making him look genuinely monstrous. The effect was incredible. Fisher immediately realized they'd captured something special. He asked Lee if he could do the lunge again. Lee said yes. They filmed the moment from multiple angles. Each time, Lee pushed himself to the physical limit. Each time, his eyes filled with more broken blood vessels. By the end, Lee's eyes looked like something from a nightmare. The makeup department didn't add anything. That was all Lee's real blood showing through. When editors assembled the scene, they realized the bloodshot eyes made Dracula seem less human. This wasn't a man with fangs. This was something else. The eyes suggested rage beyond human limits, a monster barely containing its fury. The shot became the most famous image from the film. Posters featured Lee's blood-red eyes. That single moment defined Dracula's appearance for generations. Lee paid a small price. His eyes stayed bloodshot for several days. They ached and felt dry. But Lee didn't mind. He knew they'd created something unique. An accident born from commitment became the film's signature. Sometimes the best moments can't be planned. They happen when an actor gives everything and luck captures it. Number 1. The film that almost had a different ending. The ending you see in Horror of Dracula wasn't the original plan. Fisher shot a completely different conclusion first. In that version, Van Helsing didn't destroy Dracula with sunlight. Instead, the final confrontation happened at night. Van Helsing and Dracula fought in darkness. Van Helsing drove a stake through Dracula's heart. The vampire died slowly, looking into Van Helsing's eyes. There was a moment of understanding between them. Then, Dracula crumbled to dust. Van Helsing knelt in exhaustion and grief. It was quiet and somber. Fisher filmed this ending over 2 days. Everyone thought it worked well. It felt respectful and sad. But when test audiences saw it, they were disappointed. They wanted something more dramatic. The whole film had been building intensity. The quiet ending felt anticlimactic. People expected a spectacular finish. The studio panicked. They'd spent their budget. They didn't have money for reshoots. But they also couldn't release a film that disappointed audiences at the crucial final moment. Producer Anthony Hines made a bold decision. He scraped together emergency funds. They would film a new ending. It had to be cheap and fast, but spectacular. Fisher came up with the sunlight idea. Van Helsing tears down the curtains. Sunlight destroys Dracula. It would be dramatic and visually exciting. More importantly, it could be filmed quickly with special effects instead of elaborate stunts. They had 2 days. Peter Cushing performed his table sliding stunt. Christopher Lee filmed his death scene. The effects team created the dust and decay sequence. Everyone worked overtime. The new ending was assembled in editing. When test audiences saw it, they went wild. People cheered when Van Helsing tore down the curtains. They gasped when Dracula burned in sunlight. The ending delivered the excitement they wanted. The original ending was completely cut. For years, people didn't know it existed. Then, in the 1990s, film historians discovered script notes describing the alternate version. They searched for the footage. Parts of it still existed in archives. Hammer released some clips as bonus features on special edition releases. Fans could finally see what almost was. Watching the original ending is strange. It's good, but it's not right. The sunlight ending feels inevitable, like it was always meant to be that way. But it was a last-minute save. One decision made under pressure created the perfect conclusion. The film's most triumphant moment was born from panic. Sometimes disaster forces greatness. Bonus fact, the secret inspiration behind Hammer's Dracula Hears something almost nobody knows. Horror of Dracula was inspired by a stage play, not the original novel. In 1952, a British theater company produced a dramatic adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The play was different from the book. It simplified the story and focused on the battle between Dracula and Van Helsing. It cut many characters and changed the setting. Terence Fisher saw that play and loved it. Years later, when Hammer Films decided to make a Dracula movie, Fisher suggested they use the play's structure instead of adapting the novel directly. The studio agreed. Screenwriter Jimmy Sangster read the play and the novel. He borrowed from both, but leaned heavily on the play's simplified narrative. That's why Horror of Dracula is so different from Stoker's book. It's not actually a direct adaptation. It's an adaptation of an adaptation. characters appear who aren't in the novel the same way. Plot points are changed. The geography is different. For decades, literary critics complained that the film didn't respect Stoker's work. They didn't know the filmmakers weren't really trying to adapt the novel. They were adapting a play. The play has since been forgotten. It's rarely performed anymore. But its structure lives on in one of the most famous horror films ever made. Theater became film, became legend. One medium transformed into another, creating something new. The roots remained hidden for years. Most fans still don't know where the film's unique structure really came from. Old tools, new magic. Horror of Dracula proved that monsters could be reborn. An old story became new through color and courage. Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing created characters that defined good and evil for generations. Behind the elegant costumes and gothic sets, artists worked incredibly hard. They bled, they sweated, they risked failure. They fought censors and budgets and time. They solved impossible problems with creativity. Broken fangs became silent menace. Tiny sets became grand castles. Happy accidents became iconic moments. The film taught us that horror doesn't have to hide in shadows. It can stand in bright light and still terrify us. More than that, it showed that even monsters can be tragic. Even heroes can be tired. The best stories live in complicated spaces between fear and sympathy. Decades later, Horror of Dracula still holds power. New generations discover it and feel that old magic. The blood still shocks, the performances still mesmerize, the music still makes hearts race. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.